Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, Professor Tama. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I will just read my paper. I sent my paper, and I don't know if all of you have my paper, but it will be easier for me. Otherwise, maybe I will talk too much, because it is, of course, extremely hard to summarize Islamic mysticism or Christian mysticism or Jewish mysticism in 30 minutes. So I will stick to my paper, but then, of course, afterwards we can discuss about everything and go into more also in detail, or also speak about things which I could not mention even here in this paper. The concept of mysticism in Islam. Islam is not a monolithic thing, but a dynamic, process-oriented world religion with many facets, and presents itself differently depending on the regional, cultural, and historical context. Nowadays, the extreme and violent manifestations of Islam in particular receive attention, even if the spiritual and peaceful aspects have always been dominant. One of the always present but highly neglected aspects is the dimension of Islamic mysticism. This lecture will introduce into the foundational, especially theological, ethical, and psychological concepts and taxonomies of Islamic mysticism, which is also known as Sufism or dervishhood. Simultaneously, I will try to illustrate in short the complex historical context of Islamic mysticism. So I start with the historical development of the concept. History, including the history of Sufism, is never monocausal and unilinear, but multicausal and multi-layered. At the same time, every historical narrative is inevitably a selective, at best intersubjective construction. For this reason, the history of Sufism cannot be outlined at this point, only a history of Sufism. In doing so, I orientate myself on the representations of Orientalists such as Annemarie Schimmel, but also on the perspective of Sufi scholars such as Mehmet Ali Aini. From the point of view of the Sufis, God created the world out of love, especially out of love for the Prophet Muhammad, who is therefore called beloved of God, Habib Allah. Conversely, Muhammad loved his creator and his creation, which is why he bears the title Lord of or Sultan of Lovers, Sayyid al-Ashiqeen or Sultan al-Ushaq. Correspondingly, at the center of Sufi theology, alongside love, we find unity, since love demands the unity of lovers. So there is no duality and no separation in the divine reality, but only a universal unity between God and his creation, whereby love is the connecting element. This ontological teaching is also referred to as unity of being, wahdat al-wujud. From an ethical point of view, strict asceticism, zuhd, was at the center of Islamic mysticism, especially in the first centuries. After Muhammad's death, his descendants and some of his companions are said to have preserved and passed on this mystical theology. For example, his daughter Fatima, her husband Ali, who was also the cousin of the Prophet, their two sons Hassan and Hussein, or Hussein's great-grandson Jafar as-Sadiq. A few decades later, the mystics Rabia al-Adawiyya from Basra, Bayazid al-Bistami from present-day Iran, and the Egyptian Dhunnun came to prominence. Again, a few decades later, Mansur al-Hallaj, who became known as the martyr of love, Shahid al-Ishq, because of his execution, appeared. He had repeatedly publicly proclaimed that he was the ultimate reality, al-Haq. He said, Ana al-Haq. Although he was aware that this attribute belongs to the Quranic names of God. and his exclamation sounded as if he wanted to say, "I am God." Al-Hallaj is said to have taken the execution as a mercy from God, since it enabled him to quickly unite with his beloved. By this time, there were already countless Sufis throughout the so-called Islamic world, or Islamicate world better, and gradually they began to write systematic works on mysticism. For example, the works of Al-Hakim al-Tirmizi, Abu Nasr al-Sarraj, Abd al-Karim al-Kushairi, or Abu Hamid al-Ghazali are still among the classics of Sufism. Ahmad al-Ghazali, the latter's brother, not only wrote important works, but became the founder of a dynamic school of mystical love. His disciple, Ayn al-Qudad al-Hamadani, who was also a brilliant jurist, was executed in 1131 when he was just 33 years old for preaching that it was possible to attain divine truth through various religious paths. From around this time, the first Sufi orders, tariqa or turuq, emerged, as the historical actors began to organize themselves as communities, each with their own shrines, convents, costumes, headgear, rituals, prayers, songs, and even dances. Thus, the followers of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani formed the Qadiriya order, and the followers of Ahmad Yasawi formed the Yasawiya order, and there are hundreds and thousands of other orders starting from these times. As far as the design of the orders is concerned, there were also parallels to Islamic chivalry, futuwa. In the 13th century, Sufism perhaps reached its aesthetic intellectual peak because of the simultaneous activity of what are probably the two most famous Islamic mystics, Maulana Rumi, who came from what is now Afghanistan, and Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, who was born in Andalusia. Now I will speak about basic terminology and some of the sources of the concept, and especially the sources Quran and Hadith, and the concept in relation to the other two monotheistic religions, and a little bit about current state of the concept in research. The question of whether Sufism, taṣawwuf, represents a specifically Islamic form of mysticism with fundamentally fixed rules, or a kind of universal mysticism per se that cannot be limited to the Islamic religion, is still the subject of controversial discussion today. On the one hand, this is because there are already different positions regarding the etymology of the Arabic word Sufi, whereby it is most often derived from these three roots. From Suf, the Arabic word for wool, according to this, a Sufi would be someone who wears a woolen robe in the manner of the ascetics. Then Safa, the Arabic word for purity, according to this, a Sufi would be someone who strives for spiritual purity. And thirdly, Sufa, the Arabic word for veranda, referring to those companions of Muhammad who were so ascetic on the one hand and so hungry for knowledge on the other that they spent day and night on the veranda of the mosque in Medina in the immediate vicinity of the Prophet, which is why they were called people of the veranda, Ahl as-Sufa. So a Sufi would be someone who follows this ascetic tradition. Apart from the third form, these are not necessary derivations from a specifically Islamic context, since an ascetic who strives for spiritual purity while wearing a cotton robe does not necessarily have to be a Muslim. The notion that the word Sufi has anything to do with the Greek word for wisdom, Sophia, is rejected by most Sufi scholars. In addition to the etymology, the definition of the term Sufi is also ambiguous. For example, the Sufi scholar Ahmad al-Zarruq writes that there are 2,000 definitions of the word taṣawwuf. However, However, it can be assumed that al-Zarruq's words are not to be understood as criticism, but as an indication of the complexity of this phenomenon and an appreciation of the countless paths to God. For 3 centuries earlier, Najm ad-Din al-Kubra had taught that the number of paths to God is identical to the number of breaths of all creatures. الطرق إلى الله بعدد أنفاس الخلائق. So, as many as breaths of the creation, so endless. So the path to God varies in every creature from breath to breath. Another Sufi named Abul Hasan al-Bushanji, in Turkish sources, in non-Turkish sources, he's mainly called al-Fushanji, on the other hand, had criticized what he considered to be an inflationary, I don't know how to pronounce it, inflationary use of the term taṣawwuf. He says, today Sufism is a name without any reality, any haqiqah. Previously, it was a reality without a name. This kind of fundamental criticism even gave rise to its own mystical current, which is still influential today, which rejected the term Sufi, and most of the rituals and habits that had established themselves in Sufism, or at least declared them to be ineffective. They were convinced that the display of mystical identity was detrimental to spiritual development and led to superficiality and arrogance. Instead, representatives of this mystical path called themselves people of blame or self-blame, Ahl al-Malama. However, despite these controversies and uncertainties regarding the etymology and definition of the central term, it remains to be said that the majority of Sufis, traditional scholars, and also modern researchers argue that Sufism is not a universal mysticism per se, but one, albeit one characterized by many external influences, Islamic and Sharia-compliant variant of mysticism. For example, Mark Sedgwick's study Sufism, the Essentials, states that there is an essential nature of Sufism and that there are also essential practices. However, most outsiders who only know superficial variants of Sufism are not aware of this, so Sedgwick. According to Sedgwick, the vast majority of Sufis follow the rules of Sharia very meticulously, and all Sufi masters are also teachers of the exoteric rules of Islam. Among the essential phenomena of Sufism, he counts the Islamic religious foundations, love for the Sufi master, the Sufi community, the regulations of the orders and spiritual exercises, such as the commemoration of God, dhikr, and forms of seclusion, khalwa. The Orientalist Annemarie Schimmel, who died in 2003, argued similarly to Sedgwick. She always emphasized that one could neither understand nor practice Sufism without knowledge of the Quran and love for the Prophet Muhammad. The idea that there is a dichotomy between Islam and Sufism and that some famous Sufis have been executed over the centuries for this reason is also untenable because it overlooks the fact that genuine Sufism grew out of Islamic roots, says Schimmel. However, just like Sedgwick, Schimmel does not deny that there were various cultural, philosophical, and religious influences on Sufism from the beginning. She names Christian hermits, Hinduism, and Buddhism, and adds, quote, "But after Hermetic thoughts have been widespread throughout the Orient since the Hellenistic period. And they certainly also had an effect on some early Sufis. But precise proof of such influences is difficult to provide, since they were, so to speak, in the air." However, this essentialist view of authors such as Schimmel and Sedgwick that a Sufi must be both a Muslim and adhere to the Quran and the Islamic commandments is not shared by all Sufis and not by all Sufism researchers. This can be seen, for example, from the biography and teachings of the Indian Sufi master Hazrat Inayat Khan, who stayed in the USA and Europe between 1910 and 1926, and whose English language lectures were co-written and published by his followers. For him, who was both a gifted musician and poet, Sufism is the spirit and essence of Islam, but also of all other religions and even philosophies. Quote, "The idea that Sufism sprang from Islam or from any other religion is not necessarily true, yet it may rightly be called the spirit of Islam as well as the pure essence of all religions and philosophies. A Sufi considers all prophets and sages not as many individuals, but as the one embodiment of God's pure consciousness, or the manifestation of divine wisdom, appearing on earth for the awakening of man from his sleep of ignorance in different names and forms." Unquote. One of his prayers makes it clear that the Sunni Muslim Indian Inayat Khan saw not only the prophets of the Abrahamic religions mentioned in the Quran, but also Rama, Krishna, Shiva, Buddha, and Zarathustra as transmitters of divine truth. Quote, "Most gracious Lord, allow us to recognize thee in all thy holy names and forms, as Rama, as Krishna, as Shiva, as Buddha. Let us know thee as Abraham, as Solomon, as Zarathustra, as Moses, as Jesus, as Muhammad, and in many other names and forms known and unknown to the world." Unquote. His universality becomes even clearer when he humorously notes that the uncertainties regarding mysticism were caused by the semi-mystics and quarter-mystics. The difficulty is that there are half mystics, I quote, "The difficulty is that there are half mystics and quarter mystics, and yet all of them are regarded as mystics, and this causes confusion. When a person says, I am a Christian mystic, or a Jewish or a Muslim mystic, he has not yet arrived at mysticism. Mysticism cannot be divided into different sects, and the one who says, my mysticism is different from your mysticism, has not yet arrived there, for true mystics cannot differ. The further one progresses on the spiritual path, the more experiences one has which are similar to those of others in the advanced stage. On closer inspection, however, it becomes clear that Inayat Khan's universalism also had limits or was not meant in an absolute sense. Despite all his openness, he also expected his non-Muslim followers to respect and even accept core Islamic beliefs. Thus, in his teaching too, Muhammad remains the last prophet, after whom there is no longer a messenger of God, because he brought the final message of divine wisdom, namely that only God exists. Quote, and the work was thus continued by all prophets until Muhammad, the Khatam al-Mursaleen, the last messenger of divine wisdom and the seal of the prophets, came on his mission, and in his turn gave the final statement of divine wisdom. None exists but Allah. There was no necessity left for any more prophets after this divine message, which created the spirit of democracy in religion by recognizing God in every being. Here it is unquote. Here it is noticeable that Inayat Khan, like most Sufis, interprets the sentence, there is no deity but God, la ilaha illallah, as there is no being but God, la mawjuda illallah. Original and also modern, however, in his conclusion, is his conclusion that according to this statement revealed by God, there was no longer any need to send new prophets, since it, through the recognition of God's immanence in every human being, kindled the spirit of democracy in religion. At one point, Inayat Khan even goes so far as to describe Islam as the only world religion that can meet the needs of the Western world. But the Christian missionaries and the prejudices of the people stand in the way, according to Inayat Khan. Quote, "Among the existing religions of the world, Islam is the only one which can answer the demand of Western life. But owing to political reasons, a prejudice against Islam has existed in the West for a long time. Also, the Christian missionaries, knowing that Islam is the only religion which can succeed their faith, have done everything within their power to prejudice the minds of Western people against it," unquote. His nephew, Mahmud Khan, who is also a Sufi master, perceives this obvious contradiction between universalistic, pluralistic sounding statements and practices and those that seem more essentialistic and inclusive as a fertile dialectical tension. In his view, the universalistic, pluralistic orientation clearly predominates, which is why he even describes his uncle's Sufism as secular mysticism or even mystical humanism. He justifies the secular aspect of this mysticism with the fact that it is in principle in the same proximity and the same distance to all religions and worldviews, even if every Sufi and every Sufi path has its specific historical, cultural context. In the case of Inayat Khan, for example, the specific context is the sophisticated, courtly and tolerant Indian Islam of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, coupled with later philosophical and religious influences from the USA and Europe. Inayat Khan's Sufism is therefore secular because it cannot be limited or monopolized by any religion or Sufi order. One of the most prominent and influential recipients of Inayat Khan was the first professor of Islamic mysticism in the newly founded Turkish Republic, Mehmet Ali Ayni. Also, according to Ayni, it is not only possible to speak of Islamic, but also of Hindu, ancient Egypt, ancient Greek, Jewish, or Christian Sufism. Like Inayat Khan, he defined the word Sufism not as explicitly Islamic mysticism, but as universal mysticism per se. But also for universalistic Sufis like Inayat Khan, the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet remain of central importance. As an example, a few verses either about the closeness, immanence, and experienceability of God, or about his light nature, beauty, and sublimity should be listed here. So we read in the Quran verses like, "And God's is the east and the west, and wherever you turn, there is the face of God." Or, "Then he formed him, man, and blew him from his spirit." Or, "We are much closer to him than his carotid artery." Or, "He, God, is the manifest, al-Zahir." Or, "We will make them see our signs on the horizons and within themselves until they realize that he is the truth." Or, "God is the light of heaven and earth. His light is like a niche in which there is a lamp. The lamp is in a glass, and the glass is like a twinkling star. It is kindled from a blessed tree, an olive tree, neither of the east nor of the west, whose oil almost shone, even though it touched no fire, light upon light. God guides to his light whom he will, and God makes parables for man, and God knows all things." Or, "God is the friend of the believers. He brings them out of the darkness into the light." Or, "God has beautiful names. Call him by these names." Or, "The seven heavens and the earth and all things in them praise God. There is nothing that will not sing his praises, but you don't understand them." Or, "Have you not seen that whatever is in the heavens and on the earth bows down before God? the sun, the moon, the stars, the mountains, the trees, and the animals, and many people. In addition to these verses in the Quran, there are also numerous statements by Muhammad, so-called hadith, that have a mystical content, although only the four statements that are probably best known among the Sufis should be quoted here. So one is, God is beautiful and he loves beauty. Or, God said, I was a hidden treasure and loved it to be known, so I created man. Or, he who knows himself knows his Lord. Or the fourth one, God said, if I love a servant, then I will be his ear, that he may hear through me. I will be his eye, that he sees through me, and his tongue, that he speaks through me, and his hand that he takes through me. However, the Sufis regard the Quran as a whole as a mystical book, whereby they mostly interpret the verses allegorically. This mystical form of Quranic hermeneutics is called allegorical exegesis, at-tafsir al-ishari. For example, Rumi interprets the Quranic verse, and when we made the house a meeting place for people and a place of refuge, as follows. Rumi says, quote, exotericists say, what is meant by this house is the Kaaba. For all who take refuge in the Kaaba find safety from all evils, and it is forbidden to hunt there, and no evil may be done there. God the Exalted chose that house. That's all well and good, but it's the outside, again, the zahir of the Quran. Those who know the truth say that the house is the interior of man. The meaning of Kaaba is the heart of the prophets and saints, which is the place of appearance of God's revelation. The visible Kaaba is a branch of it. Were it not for the heart, of what use would the Kaaba be? Circle the Kaaba of the heart if you have a heart. Now I will speak. I hope I have some more minutes, or maybe 5 minutes. I will summarize about some theological and philosophical principles of this concept, mysticism in Islam. Sufism is neither a law school nor a theological school. That is why one finds male and female Sufis in all Islamic schools of law and theology. There are Sufis in both Sunni and Shia Islam. Sufism is very diverse, but the ideas presented in this talk are shared by most Sufis. However, in practice, we see that Sufis are often involved in social, especially financial and political conflicts. Theoretical Sufism differs greatly from real-life Sufism. In practice, competition among Sufis is very strong. Although Sufis preach love and renunciation, in reality they often deviate from it. We remember the criticism that Sufism today is a name without a reality. At this point, the theology and philosophy of Sufis will be presented using the example of the image of God and man, of course, greatly abbreviated and generalized. The image of God is first of all shaped by the concept of tawḥīd, the concept of the oneness of God or the unity of God. So I mentioned it, there is no deity except God, la ilaha illallah. But there are different forms of tawḥīd. Theology and philosophy in general mostly see God as the necessary first being, the wajib al-wujud. But in the theology and anthropology of Sufism, God is the only being. Remember wahdat al-wujud, which I mentioned already. They speak of three levels of tawḥīd, tawḥīd al-af'al, tawḥīd al-sifat, and tawḥīd al-dhat. So the unity of the actions, that God is the only actor, I can explain later if you like. Unity of the attributes, that all attributes belong to God, and the unity of the being of God, that there is no being but God, and this one being is many times also called or said to be pure truth, haqq, or love, ishq, or light, nur. God has 99 and even many more names and attributes, and creation is the manifestation, the tajalli of these names and attributes. The sphere of God is called, for example, by Ibn al-Arabi, the hidden world, alam al-ghayb. The sphere of materialization is called the witnessed world, alam al-shahada. And in between there is the world of imagination, alam al-khayal. Regarding Sufi anthropology, it can be said that that man has not only the potential to know God, but even to recognize that one's own being is identical with God's being. Namely, that duality is just a deception and illusion. From the point of view of Sufis, all religious exercises as well as life as a whole serve to achieve spiritual perfection through the experience of the otherworldly divine sphere. Only the perfect and universal human being, the so-called Insan al-Kamil, is a true human being who is aware that he not only carries the spirit of God, Ruh Allah, within himself, but also the entire universe. All other people are not only biologically, but also spiritually on the animal level of the instinctual soul, an-nafs al-ammara, which is why such people are called talking animals, al-haywan al-natiq. The taxonomy of spiritual or psychological ethical development, which is also referred to as the 7 grades of the soul, the nafs, is usually given as follows. If you have the paper, I will not read it, you see the 7 steps, the commanding nafs, then the self-critical nafs, the inspired nafs, and so on. And the last step, the 7th, is the purified and complete nafs. And these layers are also described in the Quran. Then there are also taxonomies that represent the principles of Sufism. I show you here 2 different taxonomies of Najmuddin al-Kubra and Abdul Khaliq al-Gujdawani. So you see here the stations of development, of spiritual development, like repentance, asceticism, trust in God, modesty, and at the end, satisfaction with God. And Gujdawani has a little bit differing system. Very influential was also the taxonomy of the 4 gates formulated by Hoja Ahmad Yesawi and later by Hoja Bektashvili or Haj Bektashvili. So the first gate is the Sharia, the religious law. This is for all religious people, the so-called abid, especially ordinary people. So this is the lowest step. Then those who continue come to the step or the gate of tariqah, the mystical path or order, is only for chosen and ascetic people, the so-called zahid. Next gate is the gate of wisdom and objective knowledge of marifa or irfan or hikmah also, is only for the chosen of the chosen, the so-called arif or khawas also. And the last gate is the gate of divine truth, is only for very few extraordinary people, the so-called ashiq, the lovers, or the muhib, also khas al-khawas. Then you see here I give you again another taxonomy. This is from the book of Fariduddin al-Attar, the so-called Mantiq al-Tayr, the Conference of the Birds, where you can read it here. The birds have to cross 7 valleys, the valley of quest, the valley of love, the valley of knowledge, of detachment, of unity, of wonderment, of annihilation, and so on. And at the end, they see that the birds are identical with the king of the birds. So there is unity of them. And this last station of annihilation, fana, is usually subdivided in three levels: annihilation in the Sufi master, annihilation in the Prophet, and annihilation in God. And one further step, it is said, is the staying in God, the remaining in God, the baqa billah, and there are also other systems. So I tried to show you that there are many taxonomies like this, and of course now I could not mention a lot, so there are a lot of more names and systems and ideas and books and many points I could not mention, but maybe now we can discuss about it. And of course, then for the article, there is much more to add and to differentiate. Okay, thank you.